introduce Professor Clive Phillips. And Professor Clive Phillips is the Chair and Director of Centre for Animal Welfare and Ethics and School of Veterinary Science, University of Queensland, Australia. He has a teaching and research experience of 35 years in the field of animal welfare at the University of Wales, University of Cambridge, and University of Queensland. He has published more than 250 research papers and more than 10 books on the wide aspect of animal welfare. He worked on cattle behavior and also the welfare, as well as a live animal transport and export is also well appreciated, some of the books of Professor Clive Phillips. And we are so lucky and honored to have him here. He is the keynote speaker. And this is another thing I want to announce, Clive. Take your time. We are not dearth of time. Usually professors say, because of paucity of time, we don't have paucity of time. And this is very pertinent topic also for us. So take your time and welcome.
So I'm renowned for talking long and and I notice it's only 5 to 10 up there. Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. It's a real pleasure to be back in India. I was in Delhi last year for a course on nutrition and welfare, and before that I attended the Minding Animals conference in Delhi, which some of you may have attended. That was really, really good. But today I want to challenge you a little bit, hopefully, and the reason I want to challenge you is because we all have certain views of animal welfare, and our attitudes to animals are probably quite benign for all of you. But I want you just to think, and I hope by the end of my talk you will have thought a little bit more deeply as to why. Why should we be giving animals the considerations that we do? So, okay, just an outline of my talk then. I want to start from some of the cultural divides that we see in attitudes to animals. That'll be familiar to most of you, but just by way of introduction. And then I'll move on to looking, because I wanted to consider something which was relevant to all of you, the situation in Indian cow shelters, the goshalas. We are very fortunate today to have Arvind Sharma with us, who's been studying animal welfare in the goshalas. And I will introduce that, and Arvind will later on give more facts and figures behind the research he's done. I will briefly compare India and Chinese development in animal production systems. I'm quite involved in Chinese production systems and increasingly involved in Indian ones. And I think there's a really interesting contrast there that I'll draw out. And then the final, and perhaps the biggest part of my talk, will be about what do we really owe to animals? You, as I say, probably all have a benign attitude to animals, but the geneticists tell us that we're inherently selfish. And our genes dictate that we only look after ourselves. You know, the modern generation, I saw a T-shirt once, it said, it's the all about me generation. And I think to some extent that's true, and it makes me think, well, why do we look after animals? Why don't we just use them in any way that we want? I hope by the end of the talk I'll have just put a little bit more consideration onto that. So first of all, thinking about some of the cultural divides in attitude to animals. We live in a very globalized society, but at the same time, cultural divides persist, particularly in the field of attitudes to animals. I think it's really important that we understand the diversity of views which are held in society. It doesn't mean that culture should necessarily dictate how we look after animals. There are examples of culture sustaining very cruel practice to animals. In Spain, they might, for example, throw a goat off a church roof at a festival time. Things like that are not uncommon around the world. But I do think it's really important that in multicultural societies that we have today, we are sensitive to different cultural cultural inheritances. But first of all, we have to understand how attitudes influence our practices. And this is well known by all of you, of course. We have 3 or 4 major religions in the world, but it does just emphasize that India is rather uniquely different because it is so different to the other countries. In this little chart of religions around the world, I've listed the Christian areas with this Bible and cross, the Muslim areas with this praying imam, the Hindu areas here, of course. So these are some, and the Buddhists are over here in East and Southeast Asia. So let's just start a little bit more detail on the main tenets of those beliefs. So first of all, we have those monotheistic Abrahamic faiths, including Christianity and Islamism. Christianity, I think, at least in the early days, ran on a belief which was essentially all about dominion over animals. God said, let us make humankind in our own image. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, cattle, wild animals of the earth, every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Wonderful. Animals were put there for our benefit. We can do what we want with them. Or is it saying that? The word in Hebrew is rada, which means either lordship or mastery, or possibly careful husbandry. So a little bit more concern than we first thought. And later on, as you work through the Christian text, the Bible, it's seen that there is indeed a hierarchy of animals. You made us a little lower than yourself. Humans talking to God here in the Psalms. You made us a little lower than yourself. You crowned us with glory and honor. You let us rule everything your hands have made. You've put all of it under our power, sheep, cattle, wild animals, birds, etc., etc. But then, as we move on later, through to about 700 BC, we see that there is a more egalitarian process evolving, a covenant between God and man, where man has an arrangement with animals. I will make for you a covenant with the wild animals, the birds of the air, the creeping things of the ground, and you shall lie down in safety. Philosophers recognize that as an agreement whereby humans might provide good health, nutrition, and certain other things, and animals, by the same time, give up their right to longevity, to freedom of movement and things like that. It is said that it is an unbalanced arrangement because humans have the right to accept it or not, animals don't. Oh, sorry, have I pressed? Okay. And then through into the New Testament, very different circumstances. There's very little reference to animals in the New Testament, occasional. Look at the birds in the sky. Are you not more important than they? At the time, Israel was heavily dominated by the Romans, and the main emphasis was in rather, I think, a parallel way to how Mahatma Gandhi was resisting the dominance of the British 100 years or so ago, or a little bit less than 100 years ago. In rather the same way, the main emphasis was on human welfare. And Jesus notoriously, of course, cast demons into pigs, which rushed into a lake and all drowned. That doesn't sound very animal welfare friendly to me. Anyway, let's move on to the Islamic faith. And here in the Quran, there are many, many exhortations to look after animals well. Cattle he has created for you, similar to the other Abrahamistic faith. From them you derive numerous benefits and have their meat you eat. The traditional feast of Eid al-Adha has continued, where animals are sacrificed for the benefit of humans. Animals are slaughtered without stunning, mainly by a neck cut, and it is said in the name of God, God is great, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. But just to emphasize, here's a little selection of Muhammad's sayings. Animals have tender senses, don't torture or overload them, as they will suffer as the men do. The exhortations to treat animals well. If anyone kills a creature, even a small bird, without any reason, God will make an interpolation. God will interfere. We are not owners of animals. Creatures are not goods or properties. Actually, God is all creatures' owner. Even more of an exhortation than we saw in the Bible. And that brings us through to the Asian religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. I'm sorry to lump those two together, but by virtue of time constraints, that's what I wish to do. And here it's quite different because humans are seen as being on a continuum with animals. So there is no fundamental difference. And I will return to that later when we come to consider what do we owe to animals. The fundamental belief, of course, is in rebirth as in animal form and as gradual progression towards nirvana or to an idealized state and avoiding being reborn as animals. The principles are much more strongly, I think, ensconced in the Hinduism and Buddhist religions of ahimsa, the principle of non-violence. And so I love coming to India because I find people inherently in tune with animal welfare in a way that I must confess that I don't always find in Western society. And as a means of perpetuating good behavior towards animals, of course, in the Hindu religion, many animals are considered, or indeed most animals are considered to be gods in one form or another. So, India, I think, is unique in one particular way in the world today, and that is how cows are sheltered as sacred animals in sacred places. And these shelters, or goshalas, or gosadans, are really retirement homes for cows. Now, I wanted to tell you something about what we are doing in the goshalas, but I don't want to use a Western expression, teach grandmothers to suck eggs, because you know all about goshalas, I'm sure. But what I will do is just provide you with a little bit of the basis of our work, and that will be followed by Arvind Sharma giving you more details. So our objective in conducting this research was to look at, do cattle really suffer in the goshalas, or is it a feasible policy to look after animals for the rest of their useful life? We have many examples in the West of animals that are slaughtered at a very early age just because they're not wanted. And I talk to this about this a lot with my students. I talk about the wastage of chickens. Male chickens that are slaughtered at 1 day of age, going into a macerator to be killed, racehorses that are killed just because they're too slow, dogs that are euthanized because no one wants them. The examples are endless, and that is the way our society works. Animals are essentially a commodity. Legally, they're not much above a commodity. And so, from that point of view and from a philosophical point of view, we were very interested in what you do to keep cows alive beyond their useful life. The goshalas we recognize as unique traditional institutions where useless, sick and disabled cows are afforded food and shelter until they die of natural causes. There aren't many farm animals that die of natural causes in the world today. And they're a very old tradition. They've existed since the 3rd century BC, partly because the cow is worshipped as one of the most important goddesses. And it's led, of course, to a taboo within your society for not eating meat. And so man and animals come together in a rich and diversified cultural environment as we saw it. But it is of paramount importance when you consider welfare as opposed to rights. What you're essentially saying is that animals have a right to life, but it's important that they also have a right to good welfare. So we wanted to investigate that. We saw that attitudes and behaviour towards the cows is interwoven into Indian society with restrictions on meat consumption and a sanctity of all life. Particularly important in India because although you only have 3% of the world's total land area, you have about 1/3 of the world's cattle population. You have the biggest cattle herd in the world. And so the cow has become uniquely sacred as designated in the god Shiva, the bull, and the god herd Krishna. And that is pervading life. There are, of course, cow products, some of which are produced in the goshalas, including milk, curd and ghee, and we'll look later at what proportion of the goshalas are producing milk. And then urine and dung, which are seen as purifying agents, in the local communities. So the god Krishna is worshipped with all Hindus, and special rituals attached to the milkman communities. And the cows are worshipped especially by the priests on auspicious days. And again, a few photographs of the importance of the cow in Hindu society. It obviously means a lot to the people involved. Interesting to know, what the cow thinks about this. A lot of our research, of course, in animal welfare is trying to get inside the animal's head. What does it really perceive? And we know, and I talk to my students a lot about how cow sensory apparatus is totally different to human apparatus. But having said that, I know your Indian cows are very accepting of human presence in a way that, for example, Australian cows are not. We can approach within 100 meters. You can approach within a meter, probably. Very, very different. Okay, so it's a very old institution. The first documented evidence goes back some over 2,500 years. And it's established to provide milk in the schools, so has an important nutritional function. But more recently, of course, the concept of ahimsa and the sacred cow has become a rallying point for the Indian nation. And most importantly, when the imperial British government was here, it showed a distinct lack of interest in the goshalas. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you that when the British were over here a couple of hundred years ago, of course, some of the most serious violence erupted after the British were using beef as part of their munitions, and a very unfortunate clash of cultures occurred. I don't want to emphasize that at all. I think that's not part of what I want to talk to you about today. So what we have nowadays is more than 5,000 goshalas around India in a unique institution that is recognized by the Animal Welfare Board of India. And our studies were very fortunate in getting permission from the chairman of the Animal Welfare Board of India, Major General Karb, a couple of years ago, to conduct a detailed investigation of the welfare of cattle in India. And they harvest animals from some over 5 million street cattle in India. And of course that has become a conflict zone because of the rapid urbanization and the traffic hazards which occur, the crop raiding, and also public health concerns. And so we turned our attention to welfare assessments within the Indian goshalas, and also looking at the attitude of the general public. What do people in the street perceive in terms of the goshala? Are they doing a good thing? Are they doing a bad thing? Arvind will tell you a bit about that. And their sustainability. How sustainable is the goshala situation, the goshala system in India, when your population is growing, your demand for cattle products is growing very fast, for milk, for ghee, etc., is growing fast as affluence increases in India. And so these are some of the goshalas we visited, usually with outside yards, some pretty heavily stocked, as we see here, some not so heavily stocked, a variety of breeds, a variety of feeding methods, but all containing cows that we saw in relatively good condition, but a lot of very detailed measurements taken to really try and demonstrate. And in that we were led by the European Welfare Quality Scheme, which has devised standards for monitoring the welfare of animals. And you can see here a couple, on the one on the right with very high stocking density, the one on the left with very low stocking density. And because these cows are old and infirm, inevitably some of them are in not so good condition. And we would expect the proportion of diseased animals to be higher because as we all get older, you and me, just like cattle, we become more susceptible to diseases. What we eat is very important, and so we paid particular attention to diet. So food, very important. Quality of the water, also very important. And also the importance of philanthropy, philanthropic donations in helping to sustain the goshalas with food supplies being supplied, and also financial donations. Here's just a few of the general statistics for what we found. A goshala on average would have a couple of sheds for the cows, with about 70 animals in each shed, with about an area of 170 meters or so per shed, 750 meters per 750 square meters for the yards. That works out at an average stocking density of only about 2.7 meters squared per cow, and this would be one of the biggest differences in welfare terms between the goshalas here in India and, say, the Western dairy production systems, where cows in yards, in cow sheds, will typically have between 6 and 9 square meters per cow. Tethered cows, of which there were many, of course, had a close to 5 square meters. And then we did a lot of measurements of shed characteristics, how light they were, how noisy they were. Found actually the noise levels are very, very low, how hot they were. So some quite high temperatures prevailing, 30 degrees or so. So total number of cattle in each shelter, averaging around 230, of which there would be about 60% of those were cows. So averaging about 137 cows in each shelter, average age of about 11 years of age. So in Western dairies, most cows are long dead and buried by the time they're 11 years of age. When you think in Holland, in America, in some of the intensive dairying systems, each cow lasts between 2 and 3 lactations. And a couple of years for the cow to grow up. Each cow, on average, is only living until it's 5 years of age, which is much, much less than the average lifespan of wild cattle. If we look at, say, Boscaris cattle in India or in Malaysia, they can live easily till 20 to 25 years of age. So the natural lifespan is very much longer. The Western cattle are dying from failure to conceive, because they're lame, because they get mastitis, and a number of other diseases. About 40% of the cattle in the goshalas were identified. Nearly all of them had horns. Only about 3% were lactating, so that's important. They weren't sort of dairies by another name. Now, Arvind classified them as to whether or not they had a good temperament, and about a quarter of them were classified as being not a very nice piece of work. They were really potentially malicious to poor Arvind as he examined them. And then we have a cow comfort index, which is a proportion of cows lying, about 27%. This is an indication of how much space was available to the cows to lie down. A major feature there is what the floor is made of and whether it has any bedding. And so we found that when some 80 or so floors were measured, then at least half of them were concrete. So that's pretty hard and uncomfortable for the cows. But the yards were more often more likely to be of an earth floor, and that's more comfortable, much more comfortable for the cows. The diets were primarily based on straw and agricultural byproducts. Quite often, in about half of the cases, hay was added, and then greens were added on top of that for another 15%. So quite a variety of diets. So that just tells you a little bit about the work we've been doing as a baseline to say what is going on in goshalas, how is it working. Now, I want to move on quickly to look at the ethics of animal production in developing countries, and just to contrast a little bit what I've been seeing in China. We have major activities in China from my centre, and a little bit about what I know in India. Both countries are increasing their milk production very rapidly indeed. You can see an almost exponential growth in India compared with China, India being higher than China, and the Chinese production has tapered off a bit. Exports are still at a fairly low level, and that has been quite recent. so up to about 30,000 tonnes. India, by contrast, is exporting 1.5 tonnes or so, 1,500 tonnes, and importing just under 1,000 tonnes. So a much more parochial market in India. But the Southeast Asian systems and the East Asian systems, for example, in China, are very new. They had virtually no dairy consumption before the 1970s, whereas in India, of course, in southern Asia, it is very traditional. But in Southeast and East Asia, the economy has been increasing very fast, and they've developed a Western diet, a taste for Western diet, and so they are intensifying their dairy production a great deal. There's increased silage use, and there's much less grazing. So, for example, in China, herd size is expanding enormously. So I was up in Inner Mongolia last week, where they have many farms which are 10,000 cows plus, and the dairies, which are truly massive. I saw one of the biggest dairy which exists in the world up in Inner Mongolia, and it took no milk from the small farmers at all. So you're 2 to 3 cows with a farmer, no market for the milk. They just produce fodder now. All the market is either bought in from America or produced internally. And large amounts of feed in the form of alfalfa, soybean meal, and maize coming in from America. Of course, China has a trade war with America, but that's another issue. And so these are the sort of dairies which are developing in China, very intensive, often with very large numbers of cows, 60,000 cows, for example. I haven't got time to go into detail about this with you, but it has big animal welfare ramifications. Laminitis, acidosis, ketosis, fatty liver disease. These cows are being pushed. They are being pushed towards high lactations. And they're often supported by Western organizations, for example, Nestle, and with many business partners. So this is a major business opportunity for Chinese entrepreneurs. They get free milking machines, free assistance, free nutritional advice, and they're setting up very intensive dairy farms. It's happening, and they have their eye on the export market as well. By contrast, of course, the Indian situation, there are some nutritional problems, but there are large numbers of very small herds, 30 million cows, but a lot of them are in small herds of 2 to 3 cows in villages, fed on rice straw, natural grasses, tree leaves, and byproducts and waste. You might think of this as a more sustainable system, perhaps, but probably a less efficient system, because a lot of the food goes to maintaining the cow. But less efficient in that respect, but you're not importing alfalfa from America to sustain your cows. The transport costs of that are very high. We know that in India there's a shortage of fiber and other nutrients, especially in the dry season. And the food for street cattle, of course, is very variable. So your food base is very varied, and the knowledge structure around that is not nearly as strong as those intensive production systems, leading quite commonly to undernutrition. We don't know exactly the impact of undernutrition on cow welfare, but we can speculate that the cow initially becomes hungry, but it probably doesn't feel hungry throughout its period of starvation. We think of Mahatma Gandhi and his periods of starvation that he went through. He felt hungry in the early stages, but I'm pretty sure it is not beneficial for any animal to maintain a high level of stress when they're undernourished. Being stressed is very expensive, energy-wise. And so the animal goes into a stage of pica, look for other foods where you can, frustration if you can't find them. And then the animal begins to shut down, lethargy, because wait and see what happens. Maybe someone will bring some food. Then if no food comes, exhaustion and death. That's pure speculation. We have not much evidence for that. So what can India do about that? And this is not a talk about improved feeding systems, and they've tried and tested methods. But India has a lot of sociological socioeconomic and other issues to deal with to try and support and maintain and sustain that cattle production system. And they're tried and tested, upgrading straw, using bagasse and chaff, tree fodder, integrated systems. You've heard all this before. Developing better feed standards for animal welfare. You may not have heard about that, because most of the feed standards were developed in the West for high-producing cows. We don't have good energy, protein, mineral standards for maintenance-level cows. And then another strategy is, and you've heard this many times, I'm sure, greater output from fewer animals, increasing the genetic merits of the cows to mean that less food goes into maintaining the animal and more into productivity. And crop residue use from that famous Indian nutritionist and goat specialist, Devendra, who was so involved in improving the nutrition of low-grade ruminants in India. Restricted suckling systems as well make a lot of sense to allow the cow to produce milk for both her calf and for the milking machine. Western scientists and the West are coming to look at that as a possible way of keeping cows in some very advanced countries where the greatest concern about animal welfare exists. In Denmark, for example, they are now setting aside nurse cows which can be used to maintain the calves rather than just feeding them milk powder, because it always seems crazy, ridiculous to take the milk from the cow, dry it at great expense, bag it up, and then ship it back to the farm to be diluted again and fed to the calves. Why don't you put the calf directly on the cow? Well, of course, there are very good economic reasons why you don't, but biologically, it doesn't make any sense. And so there are significant advantages in the restricted suckling systems in developing countries. Nutrition meetings as well to consider those constraints of nutrition are also very important. Water quality, of course, is terribly important in growing societies where the population is increasing a lot, and there are many potential water quality issues both here in India and very much in China as well. What does the future hold? Organic farming in India? Well, Sikkim, of course, in 2016 proclaimed itself 100% organic. Other states are tending to verge towards organic, and yet the cynic will say you could never feed the world with organic farming. But others will say, well, fertilizer production is hugely expensive energy-wise, it produces a lot of pollution, and so is that really a sustainable system? These are all issues that have to be importantly considered. Okay, I've talked a little bit at a rather more parochial level. I now want us to think a little bit more expansively as to what does this tell us about our responsibilities to animals? What do we think about when we consider our responsibilities to animals? Well, as my former colleague Donald Broom, who I saw in one of Deborah's photos there, used to say, start with your definitions. And so we must define animal life. What is animal life when we come to think of what we owe it? How and why did animal life emerge? Why is it here? How unique is it? Presumably, if there's animal life on every planet around us, in every form imaginable, we would be rather less inclined to say, well, we must preserve this species because it doesn't exist anywhere else. What do we actually value in animal life? What is beneficial to the animals and to ourselves? And how does this differ between cultures? I won't have time to talk about that much. And finally, and again, I won't have time to talk about it, but we can discuss, should we harmonize respect for animals around the globe? And if so, to what would we harmonize? We are seeing globalization in so many other areas. We don't see it much in relation to attitudes to animals because these are so culturally entrenched. And I'm positing the question that maybe we should be looking at harmonization of those attitudes. So first of all, what characterizes animal life? Well, the biologists will tell us that it's responding to stimuli, and animals all move. They respire, they utilize oxygen, and they expel carbon dioxide. And most importantly, they reproduce. Why do they reproduce? Well, Earth has enormous climatic variation, but it has an atmosphere to try and diminish that. And the more I read and think about this, I think that variation in the environment on Earth has been very instrumental in creating animals that not only live, but they exist to reproduce. Why is that? Because reproduction causes variation. It allows us to diversify, and so when things change, we can have form and function that will meet those changes, that will be suitable. Now, we know that the earliest forms of life developed in areas where there were dramatic changes in the Earth's atmosphere, at the edges of the plate tectonics, for example, in thermal vents in the oceans. This is where the microorganisms first developed. And the reason I think why that was is because through one of the key aspects of animal life is reproduction, and through reproduction they could vary continuously. And that enabled them to survive in those changeable conditions. Other requirements for life are a certain temperature range, -15 to +122 degrees, the presence of water, or at least a high relative humidity, and the existence of some fundamentals to keep the biochemical processes going, energy and nutrients. So that's how did animal life emerge in a very quick nutshell. But why did animal life emerge? Well, Darwin, of course, I think was so fundamentally important here because he said animal forms change in response to selection pressures, mainly through sexual reproduction. Darwin was, of course, not unique. That thought had been emerging in society at that time. Darwin was just at the right place in the right time to crystallize his ideas. So from that, we can deduce animal form changes over time, and animals are responding to variation in the environment. Where does that variation come from? First of all, we have rhythmical variation in the climate. We're all well aware of that. There's seasonal variation. There are many different sources of variation. Then we have geological perturbations, those edge-of-the-plate tectonics, for example. And thirdly, and what we're now coming to realize as being much more important, is that the Earth's atmosphere is affected a great deal by what goes on in outer space. Since Newton's time in the 17th century, we've thought of the universe as a very static, continuous existence with a number of laws and rules which are immutable. Einstein, of course, classically showed that some of them are not immutable. And as time's gone on, I think we've seen that we live in a world of enormous change, and one of those is space weather. So, seasonal variation over time and longer is one major source of variation. The Earth's ice age cycles, for example, we're told we're entering another one. And these are driven by the erratic circumnavigation of the Earth around the Sun, partly as to whether it's elliptical or not, and that changes every 100,000 years or so. There are solar cycles as well of 11 years or so, lots of different rhythms and cycles causing variation in the Earth. Space weather as well. Meteors and comets, sunspots causing eruptions that change the Earth's atmosphere, and coronal mass ejections, as we can see here. If you're on the Earth, then it causes a lot of changes that we are increasingly less able to deal with as society becomes more complex. If you're on the Moon, then like this fella here, then you're probably not quite so worried as the comet hits the Earth. So, changing life form protects against environmental variation, absolutely critical to the maintenance of life on the Earth. So what is the meaning of life? Life is then a response to disequilibria. and a response to environmental variation over time. And the reproduction, sexual and asexual reproduction, both creates novel forms. So that, I think, tells us a little bit about how and why life evolved and developed. There are much bigger questions which I think we as animal welfare scientists and animal ethicists need to consider. One of which is, which animals are worthy of moral consideration? Legally, of course, we tend to consider only the vertebrates. The invertebrates, even though some of them are quite sentient, lobsters, octopi, for instance, the invertebrates are usually not considered worthy of moral consideration in law. We tend to constrain our consideration to the sentient animals, and most specifically to animals from whom we benefit. We will have different laws for laboratory animals, from which we benefit a great deal, compared to pest animals, which in Australia we can go out and shoot pretty much whenever we want to, be they kangaroos in the middle of the night, or wild dogs, or any number of pest animals, and particularly the ones that the British brought over a couple of 100 years ago. Those are particularly suitable for destruction, according to the Australian legislation. The other consideration, which is growing, I think, in interest, is that we have some responsibility to all animals. We have moral duty to all animals. And then we must consider, what do we owe to the animals? Do we owe anything to them at all? And if we do we owe them a happy life? Peter Singer, that noted animal philosopher, with his utilitarian principles, essentially focused on maximum happiness for as many animals, including humans, as possible. So the focus was happiness. Others have said we owe to animals a certain degree of rights, that we owe animals a life. Famous American philosophers have advocated that point of view. And James Yates in the United Kingdom has more recently indicated that we should be giving animals a good life. To me, that begs the question of who's deciding whether it's a good life or not, and what currency are we using, more importantly. Marion Dawkins in Oxford has a nice definition of what we should be providing for animals, and that is a healthy life and what they want, indicating that animals to some extent understand what they need and will select that. So we don't necessarily need always to make the choices for them. We should lead animals to make their own choices. And there are even bigger questions than that. Why is animal life finite? Well, I believe it's so that animals can reproduce and change their form and function. The concept of an immortal human being, to me, is an anathema. It should not exist, because we all have to allow for our descendants to change, and to change in a way that is beneficial for their existence on the planet. Why does life exist at all? Well, I'm afraid I don't really have an answer for that, other than it exists because it could develop in those disequilibria circumstances. And then another very important question, which I hinted at earlier: are there other planets with life? There are in the cosmos some 40 billion Earth-sized planets. Few have water, but some do. And it's possible that is important for life, but it's also possible that other media could be used for animal life, such as methane. And so that brings me to a very important concept which emerged in the middle of the last century. Now, Enrico Fermi was a physicist in Italy, and he developed what's called a paradox. It was actually it developed from a conversation which he had at morning tea one day in the middle of the last century, where he speculated that life should definitely have evolved on other planets, given the number of suitable sites and the time for it to occur, but apparently it hasn't, and this may be due to the complexity of them being able to contact us. Apparently it hasn't, and why hasn't it occurred? So we ask ourselves, how unique is animal life, and does it matter? That Fermi paradox is key, and it essentially says that Technically able beings from other planets have not yet made us aware of their presence, and yet they should have done, because there are billions, or at least millions, of other suitable planets from which animal life would evolve. And given the rate of evolution of animal life on this planet, we would expect that some of them would become far more complex than ourselves. And we're not necessarily the most complex animal on Earth, but we're probably the most technically able. And why haven't they contacted us? So such life should have evolved. What are the possible explanations? One is, I think, that complex life will always ultimately destroy itself. This could even be a universal law. As evidence for that, we could point to the mass extinctions of the dinosaurs, which we know occurred as a result of meteor strike on the Earth. And therefore, there may be a natural limit to animal intelligence. Our brain already, the human brain, utilizes 25% of our energy intake. It's hugely expensive in energetic terms to have this little thing wandering around on the top of our body, which does all our cognitive processing. Hence, it's not surprising that no other animals have developed a brain capacity like ourselves. And so we can think of a complex life hypothesis that it's beneficial in steady state conditions to get more and more complex, more and more cognate, higher and higher cognitive ability until any risks occur. We know already that larger, more complex organisms live longest and dominate the others. So the human being is long-lived, and it tends to have mastery over the planet, over the animals on the planet, bringing me back to those original concepts outlined in the Bible and in Islamic faith. And eventually, however, the risks of getting cleverer will outweigh the benefits. So we can speculate that there's a law of complex life ultimate destruction, where the species and the individuals within the species compete in a struggle for existence. We know that. Darwin told us a lot about that. But that complex, intelligent life forms will evolve because those are the ones that have the intelligence to colonize new environments. Humans have colonized the Earth. We live everywhere on the Earth, pretty much. We're now colonizing space, or starting to. But such life forms use novel, risky strategies to expand their territory. And at some point, these will be destroyed by chaotic intervention, such as a meteor or eradicating the dinosaurs. So that variation in the environment is critically important. Therefore, life forms capable of contacting us may be outside of the natural laws of the universe. Okay, back to more prosaic thoughts. What is humans' role in caring for animals? We've discussed and considered life is circumstantial and it's transient, evolving in response to variation in environments. That tells me I don't think animals specifically have rights per se, but I think we have responsibilities to animals because we dominate them and because we are all part of a natural ecosystem. So we have to consider, are human animals different to other animals? For years, humans have been looking for unique features of human beings. Language was often postulated as one of those unique features, but we now know that some animals have quite complex forms of language. They have some forms of rudimentary syntax in birdsong, for example, and there are regional variations. So that isn't the Holy Grail, that unique feature of human life. Another one, which I think is perhaps more plausible, we can perceive beauty. We can perceive beauty in the stars. We can perceive beauty in the human form. Another one, we can recognize the existence of a God. It possibly is unlikely that any other animal can do that. But with both of these characteristics of human life, it's quite possible that this is only of adaptive benefit. These characteristics of our cognitive life existed and evolved for our own benefit. If I see beauty in the stars, I look at them a lot and I remember them, And as a primeval human being, I could navigate from that. I could find my way around. Similarly, the existence of a God is quite beneficial because the religions tell me how to behave within a society. They're generally society-based, and they're pretty useful in terms of keeping society alive and well in a suitable form. But on the other hand, we could say perhaps these are evidence of a God-given role in preserving nature. I'm postulating two sides of the same coin, that one may be true or the other may be true. I'm not saying either way. But regardless of that, we have control over nature. And so it seems to me obvious and logical that it would be folly for us to destroy that nature, both for our future, but also for the future of planetary ecosystems. So from that point of view, we need to preserve animal life in a diverse form and in a good state of welfare. Our responsibilities, therefore, are maintaining life in a sustainable form. The species eradication that we've seen as a result of human intervention in the last 100 years has been unsustainable. We need to respect established animal ecosystems better than we do and use our collective wisdom to manage planetary resources. It's no good saying, oh, such and such is a natural event. Drought in Australia is quite natural, and the animals die from drought because it's a God-given event. It's not. It's, drought is caused by human intervention as well as natural climate change, and to consider it as a God-given intervention, I think, is folly. I sometimes go to a church in my hometown in Australia, and we pray for rain. Well, when I do that, I'm perhaps thinking of the next talk that I might give to my students rather than praying for rain. And when I want my students to consider these issues of animal ethics, I give them a little test, a little task, and I'll just run through that with you. Am I okay for time, Mr. Chairman? Yeah, okay. Okay. Right, so this is what I say to my students in encouraging them to use a method in interpreting animal ethic issues, because we all have animal ethics issues all around us. Vets have to contend with people bringing dogs in to euthanize when they're perfectly healthy. How do they make that decision on what to do? Many ethical issues all the time, particularly for veterinarians. So this is what I say to my students. It's a bit way out there, but it encourages them to think. So their mission, should they accept it, is this little ethical dilemma. It's 2050. Most of them are young enough to be able to think that far ahead. I'll probably be pushing up daisies, as they say. So the first manned mission to Mars is on a rocket powered by the sun, so capable of long-distance travel over very long periods. The spacecraft heads for an area of known water existence in former times. This is actually based on reality, or what we know about life on Mars as currently happens. And there was recently, you may have seen on the news, a mission to Mars launched, which will head to areas of former water existence in Mars. So it happens, and those areas are known of potential subterranean water. In a deep fissure, the humans find remains of underground ancient canals full of water. Not completely unlikely. One of these contains large round objects that look similar to primitive life forms, such as the strombolites on Earth. In Australia, we have some life forms in Western Australia, which are big, round, saucer-like objects, are containing microorganisms that grow very, very, very slowly, and they have lived for thousands of years. They're the oldest living organisms on Earth. And so these are found on Mars. Microscopic examination back in the capsule shows evidence of slow-growing microorganisms. So Mission Control is contacted, and they recommend bringing a sample back to Earth. The cosmonauts are ready to return to Earth. But after leaving the Martian environment, the sample starts to grow rapidly. Soon it has almost filled the container. the astronauts contact mission control again to work out what to do next. So, the mission of the students as I present to them, as one of the world's only astrobioethicists, you are on hand to advise how to handle this ethical issue of finding extraterrestrial life. And the students have to consider, what rights does the organism have, if any? What are our responsibilities towards it? Who are the stakeholders in this dilemma? Who is important to consider in this situation? And how might they be affected by different courses of action? What are the possible courses of action? One of them is to jettison the organism, abandon it to outer space and ultimate destruction. Second course of action is to return it to Mars. We heard the spacecraft was capable of long-distance travel with solar cells. Third possible course of action, take the organism back to Earth. So 3 possible courses of action. And the students are asked to consider what is the right course of action. And they get themselves into groups, they consider, they report back in the usual way in which we teach our veterinary students. I use a framework which is called Preston's Ethic of Response. There are 3 main ethical frameworks that we can use to try and evaluate this dilemma. One is deontological, which is related to animal rights, a duty to universal principles, such as do as you would be done by. Don't harm other animals unless you don't mind being harmed yourself, for example. A second is the one we've heard about, the utilitarian framework, happiness, doing the greatest number for the greatest good, the greatest things for the greatest good. And the third framework, main framework, is virtue ethics. What sort of a person do I want to be to reach a state of contentment, perhaps, in my final years? A life integrated happily with a sense of purpose, lived within a community. That is probably much more readily understood by our Indian audience than it might be, for example, by a Western audience, because it's part of your religious framework. And then we put it all into a template such as this, where we identify the stakeholders on the left-hand side, and then we look at the different courses of action and the 2 main frameworks, respecting life, respecting well-being. So this is the animal rights considerations. These are the animal welfare considerations. We give each ticks and crosses, and then we add them up, and we arrive at something like this. And we can then add them up and find that from the point of view of utilitarian ethics, the jettisoning the organism is probably the best course of action. Justice as fairness is also favouring this course of action, as is virtue ethics, because of concern about effects on Earth life forms in these 2 courses of action, returning the organism to Mars, jettisoning the organism, and bringing it back to Earth, of course, has great damage there, and so that gets a lower score. So we can use this as an ethical framework to try and evaluate. Now, it's a fanciful example. I'm sure you'll recognize that. But sometimes you need to force students to think. They need to be put into an uncomfortable position to get them to think outside their normal situation. Coming back to Earth, what are people's major concerns then in relation to animal ethics? One is animal welfare, of course, that animals have a good state of welfare throughout their life, not evaluated at any one short period of time necessarily, but over a long period of time that they have good welfare. A lot of people are also concerned about animal rights, even though I've said, personally, I don't think animals have intrinsic rights, but I think we have enormous responsibilities to animals. And then there are other issues that people get very concerned about, genetic and bodily integrity, so not harming the integrity. So animals have been used in experiments sometimes in laboratories where their bodily integrity is compromised. You know, experiments were done in the 1960s to transfer the mammary gland of goats to their shoulders to try and look at the circulatory influences. I think that's unethical, and many people would, because it's damaging their bodily integrity. Similarly, species diversity. Animals have a right to exist within their species that is being maintained over a long period of time. A lot of people will think as well that animals have a right to a certain degree of longevity. You know, we shouldn't be killing chickens, male chickens, when they're 1 day of age. They have some right to life, and that premature wastage is not a good thing. And finally, there are some uses of animals in sports, for example, which many people would not agree with. And I mentioned earlier some of those cultural issues of throwing goats off church spires, for example, which happens in Europe. So, to conclude, if I can conclude anything from such a diverse and random selection of thoughts, but just to walk you through some of the things I've been talking about, religion has had a major effect on our attitudes to animals and what we provide to animals, and it's provided enormous diversity. And I just posit the question of whether we should be harmonizing 10,000 cow units with some pretty unique and concerning animal welfare challenges. And then moving on, I talked about the apparent uniqueness of animals, and that demands our respect for them as individuals and as species. We know that humans do have control over most animal species. And considering our responsibilities to extraterrestrial animals, should we ever find them or them us, or even just speculating on what our responsibilities are, it helps us to focus on our responsibilities to terrestrial animal life on this planet. There are many concerns over our current use of animals, but I firmly believe that animal life must be preserved, respected, and revered. And with that, I'll close. I don't know if we have time for any questions, Mr. Chair. Yes.
Virtually every chicken in India comes from a battery system where they have less than 100 A4 size paper to stand on for their entire laying life.
Yes. Increase in meat consumption, which is going on in Asia at the moment, in India and in China and the southeast of Asia. It's mostly focused on poultry production, and that is being achieved primarily by intensification of the industry. You know, the village chicken is disappearing, and it's having major welfare impacts. In a book I wrote recently called The Animal Trade, I outline how I believe animal welfare is deteriorating around the globe for many reasons. And one of them is because we are intensifying our animal production. Another is that more animal production is taking place in developing countries which don't necessarily have standards for animal welfare. Another one is that we're eating a lot more chickens compared to, say, cattle, and there's a lot of chickens for every cow, and so the number of animals being affected worldwide is very great. And if we consider that the meat chicken has one of the poorest welfare circumstances of any animal that we farm, then we can see that the amount of suffering is increasing worldwide. So thank you very much.
Any more questions? So in India, there is a very strong animal rights lobby, which are pushing the animal rights to all extreme. Say that the animals should not be used for any human purpose. So we have a large livestock population, especially cattle population. But the animal welfare people are not that much active. So therefore, many a time there is always a conflict between the animal rights and the animal welfare. So is there some way out where we can, both can come together and find out the solutions to the problems?
I think is an inevitable inevitable consequence of the farming systems we are using for animals. If you look at how the rights movement emerged, it was in countries such as countries in Northern Europe, in America, where the most intensification occurred to keep animals. But I'm a firm believer that we should not just consider the animal rights movement as extreme people doing extreme things. I think when it comes to animal welfare, that many people consider that animals have a right to a certain standard of welfare. And so there is actually overlap between the rights movement and the welfare movement. I do not like personally to draw a distinction between animal rights and animal welfare. I think animal welfareists, people who support animal welfare, do so partly because they think animals have a right to a certain standard of animal welfare. The animal rightists who do extreme things are an inevitable consequence of the way we keep animals in the way we do. So, for instance, you see extremists in the environmental movements in just the same way. There will always be people who are prepared because they believe so strongly in what they do. They may seem to us to be doing some pretty strange and unsustainable things, and even to be favouring animal life at the expense of human life.